What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the same. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here. I'm founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Raphael Paulin-Daigle of SplitBase, SplitBase.com. Raphael, I don't often have people on twice on my podcast, so it's welcome back. And before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes people should check out of the podcast. I did an episode with Ian Garlic. I know, Raphael, you know Ian, videocasestory.com. He had some really interesting stories. He talked about his dad in a restaurant, and they had live dolphins in the restaurant. I always like unique ideas because it gets me thinking out of the box, and that wouldn't be normal anyways. He's in Orlando, but the restaurant was actually in Wisconsin. So having live dolphins in a restaurant in Wisconsin is definitely abnormal, very abnormal for that area, I would say.
That's wild.
And he just talked about some great stories in marketing and how important it is to highlight client stories. And that's always valuable for me to hear. Also, another episode was with Adee Clevitt. Adee Clevitt has an agency as well, and she specializes in SOPs. She actually is an easy button for a company to create SOPs, which I surprisingly, Raphael, geek out on. We talked about our favorite productivity tools, but really she helps people smooth out their operations, their hiring process, their onboarding staff process, their onboarding client process, just anything that was important to the company. So that was a really good episode as well from Adee. And check out that and many more on InspiredInsider.com. I'll have to pull up because since Raphael helps people in the B2C space, consumer packaged good, there's several venture capitalists I had on my podcast, which I'll have to find and mention because we had some interesting conversations. Because I know in that space, Raphael, it takes money to grow those brands and companies because the more they sell, the more inventory they need, and that takes cash. So we'll chat about that as well. But this episode is brought to you by Rise 25, and at Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. How do we do that? We actually do that by helping you run your podcast. We're an easy button for a company to do that. We do the accountability, the strategy, and the full execution. And Raphael, you know this, we want to make it easy so the host just can have the conversation, create amazing content, create amazing relationships, and run their business. For me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I found no better way over the past decade to profile the people and companies I most admire and share with the world what they're working on. So if you have questions, go to rise25.com. If you could also email support@rise25.com. You can also check out Raphael's podcast, Minds of Ecommerce Podcast. So if you know of an amazing B2C founder, CPG, let him know. He's had some amazing guests on. So I'm going to introduce Raphael Paulin-Daigle. He's founder and CEO of SplitBase. SplitBase is a conversion optimization and landing page agency for direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands. And we'll talk a little bit about their testing trifecta method, which they've been running for 7+ years with brands. They've helped brands like Dr. Squatch, which actually I have right here, surprisingly. So a lot of these companies I've done business with, or I personally as a consumer, ButcherBox, L'Oreal, they've added millions to their bottom line through what they do. And as I mentioned, he hosts the Minds of Ecommerce podcast, where he has top e-commerce brands share growth strategies. So, Raphael, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
So talk about SplitBase for a second. We have a lot of good topics, like bad advice out there. Yep. I see a lot of advice, stages of growth, but talk about SplitBase a little bit more and what you do.
Yeah, so SplitBase, we're an agency. We've been around for 6-7 years now. And really all we do is we work with 7, 8, and 9, mostly 8 and 9 figure e-commerce brands, and we help them scale profitably through conversion optimization. And yes, that includes A/B testing, that includes landing pages, it includes, building quizzes sometimes, doing customer research to understand why people are buying and why they're not buying. And ultimately, yeah, we work with most of our clients for years at a time, and we help them grow. Right. We really aim to be that kind of partner in their growth that can help them understand why people convert, why they don't convert, and what they can do to fix it.
What is the testing trifecta?
Yeah, the testing trifecta
and by the way,
method.
If someone's listening to the audio, there is a video piece. So I do have the SplitBase website up. So we'll poke around here as Raphael talks. So
awesome. Yeah, the testing trifecta is really the best way for me to describe how to do conversion optimization. And it's a method that we named and came up with when we started. And what it does is essentially the testing trifecta is a Venn diagram with 3 circles. At the top, you've got testing. At the bottom, that supports testing, you've got quantitative data, so analytics. And then on the other side, you've got human data, which is qualitative data. Ultimately, what we're saying, if I'm summarizing the testing trifecta method in like one sentence, is, well, ultimately, in order to be running tests that actually helps you grow, it needs to be supported by quantitative and qualitative data. And what that means is a lot of brands decide they want to start testing, they want to start doing CRO, and they're just going to look at competitors, try to figure out what they could change on their website. They're going to brainstorm with their marketing team, trying to figure out, hey, what could we be testing? And then they're just going to go and test. But testing like that, like an ad hoc testing strategy, is really the equivalent of throwing a dart blinded and hoping it works, in the bullseye. It's not, it's really luck. It's really luck and it's crossing fingers and hoping it works. So what we say is, instead of wasting your time and money, the average A/B test needs to run for 2, 3, 4 weeks. It can cost quite a bit to develop and to run, right? So if you're going to be testing, test the right things. And what we say is, in order for you to test the right things, have your test ideas backed by analytics and human data. And that's really how we've been able to, make our programs pay for themselves. Like, client hire us, and generally by month number 3, the services pays for itself more than 5 or 6 times over minimum. And we've seen sometimes 100x as well.
What are some of the mistakes people make? And we'll get into some of the bad advice in a few.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mistakes in the sense that conversion optimization is not as simple as, you build a test, you run a test. There's a lot of technical mistakes that people make. So, for example, one that I actually just tweeted, I think last week about, is a lot of people they build their A/B test, but they fail to QA their A/B test properly, right? Like, A/B tests are highly technical. They change how your website works. And sometimes a small change can actually mean a lot when it comes to the experience of your website. And technically speaking, something that can seem so simple, if it breaks, right, it could, stop people from being able to even make their purchase. And I think a lot of brands they really underestimate how much they need to QA their A/B test, to have a process, and to be really diligent about that. So I would say that that's one of the big technical mistakes I see people make all the time that can cost brands a lot of money.
Yeah, it's interesting because if we make a change to the website, I'm super paranoid. Like,
yeah,
again, because I'm not technical. So I'm like, wait, if you do this, is that going to break something else over here? Right. I just don't know enough, but obviously that happens.
Yeah, totally. Well, just imagine when you're a brand that does 30, 40, $50 million a year, right? And
yeah,
you've got a lot of devs
down for an hour. It's terrible.
Exactly. You can't afford to have your website go down for an hour. And sometimes, just changing an image, I've seen brands try to change an image on their website with an A/B test. And then it maybe worked for a little while, but then a developer on their end made some change and it created a conflict with the code. And then all of a sudden, there's this big issue where, okay, the website is unusable, right? We have, a QA process and monitoring process, and we know how to code test in a way that we can minimize that. But I think that's a risk that a lot of people that get started with A/B testing tend to forget.
So, bad advice. You've been doing this for many, many years now, and there's just stuff that people, maybe they're not as experienced and they're just sharing. Maybe they learned one thing or they did one thing or they learned it from somewhere else. What's some of the bad advice you're seeing out there?
Yeah, well, let's put it into context. I've been doing CR for about 12 years. When I started, there was basically no content on the topic. There was maybe one or two online courses. I remember the content that was being taught in there at the time. It's very different from what it is today. It's evolved. There weren't any big blogs. I think the CXL blog started appearing maybe in a year after I started or around that time, but it was still pretty small and niche. And now today, right, we're looking at, obviously, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I feel like I see less blog content these days. A lot is just happening on socials, but there's something happened, I think, post-pandemic that really caused CRO to become a hot topic, right? Conversion optimization, landing pages, all really became something that everybody wanted to do. And what that created is all of a sudden this very niche discipline, all of a sudden a lot of people are seeing opportunity for making money with it. And so a lot of people are just improvising themselves as consultants or experts in the topic, or a lot of agencies are now offering it as an upsell without necessarily knowing what it all means and the skills. So there's two sides to this. It did lead to a crop of fantastic experts, agencies and people that I really respect, that yes are newer in the space, but that are doing the right thing and are giving great advice. But just like anything else, like we've seen with SEO, like we've seen with PPC, like we've seen with content marketing, right? When you've got a discipline that gets so hot, well, for every one great expert, you have about 10 or 20 bad ones. And CRO, conversion optimization, being so complex, so technical, then there's aspects in design, then there's data analytics, and there's strategy, then there's general e-commerce knowledge, and it englobes so much of digital marketing. What happens is you have a lot of mediocre content or bad advice to sort through. And when I look at, let's say, a brand that isn't an expert at CRO and they want to start doing CRO, well, it's easy to get lost. It's easy to take bad advice and implement it because you don't know what's the good advice versus what's the bad advice. So I think when we look at some of the bad advice that I see almost every day, there's a couple things. I think Twitter and Instagram, Twitter, Instagram, but I mean like LinkedIn, has been great for people to share content. But one of the things I see all the time is brands or people launching an A/B test, a day later takes a screenshot of the test results, posts it on Twitter and says, oh, this test is doing great. Oh, or we just launched this test, is going really well for now. Love that people are sharing, but that type of content can lead people down the wrong path. Because here's the deal. Test results a day in are completely invalid. There's this, generally when you launch a test, the data from the first couple of days is going to be very wonky. One variant is going to be performing better than the other. It's going to be very wonky, but also just the math isn't there. Like, you have small sample sizes. We're still just looking at data from a day or two, and it's not representative of a full week or 2 full weeks, right? There's so many things that can change that, I don't think it's even worth looking at numbers in the beginning. It's not. Forget about even getting excited about potential wins from that test, because in a week from now, in 2 weeks from now, that test that might have appeared to be winning big on day one might actually end up losing. Right. And I think a lot of these screenshots are getting shared. And what it does is, I think, for people that don't know better, well, it creates this sort of, I don't know if expectation is the right word, but it creates a sort of
I don't know, instant
expectation that,
gratification or something. I mean, it's like you can get what you
correct.
need and get quick results, and that's what you're
Yeah.
judging off of.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I can launch a test the next day. I can end the test. I got my wins, and and then it just leads to a lot of false negatives, false positives. Um, People start to think that CRO is just this one tactic that, you launch as many tests as possible and then you make a bunch of money. It's not how it works, right? So that's definitely one of the big things I see the most.
Any other bad advice that you see that it's maybe kind of dispelling a myth?
I think the second one is there's a lot, it's very similar to what I just mentioned. And I this one is tricky, and I'll explain why. So a lot of experts, agencies, including myself, okay, so I'm putting myself in this, they're sharing test results, right? So like we had a test that was a winner. And in this case, I mean, like if I'm sharing test results, I'm sharing it when the test is statistically and mathematically valid, right? And we're confident with the results. That's, so statistics aside, we're sharing some wins because obviously, we do great work. And as an agency, well, we want to share some of our wins so people can see some of the wins. That being said, I think it does create a bit of a problem. I really try when I explain those things and I share those wins on Twitter or LinkedIn. I really give the context as to how we came up with the test idea and why this idea was relevant to this one brand and might not be relevant to your brand. But sometimes what I see is a lot of these wins are shared without any context. And what happens is, people are just keep, sharing best practices. They just keep sharing, oh, this worked for that brand. And without any context, without any warning, or without really, an educated audience on the topic or an audience that's really an expert in the topic, what happens is a lot of people are just taking those best practices or what worked for another brand as like free money. And again, then it kind of goes against our testing trifecta, which is instead of actually using analytics from your data and human feedback, qualitative survey data from your customers, and then building tests based on your own situation, well, then what people are doing is they're literally just taking what works and what's been shared across Twitter as ideas and inspiration. They're going to go test it, but they're going to waste a lot of time and money because it may not be relevant to them. And who knows, knowing how many people are not properly testing and doesn't have the right statistical backing behind their test, a lot of these wins that are being shared on Twitter may not even be true. Like they might be false positives and false negatives. Like, who knows, right? So I think I'd recommend people to be wary of that. Again, I think sharing wins can be great to understand the context. That's why I say I share them, but I say how we came up with the idea, and that can give you great ideas of how you can do your own research to come up with your own test. But I think blindly copying best practices or what people are saying are great things or things to do can lead brands into like a danger zone of a lot of time wasted on tests that won't really do anything.
Yeah. So what worked for one company may not work for another. I mean, I don't know why this pops up, Raphael, but I'm looking like someone's like, oh, we changed our red button add to cart to something else. And like, oh, okay, well, I should just change the red. Well, it maybe have to do with their brand colors or the whole color of the site. And so people take that, what you're saying is, oh, I can plug that and play in that into my company and it works, where there may be a lot of factors involved of reasons why it wouldn't work.
True. And I think, Jeremy, like you think about it, right? Like it's true for conversion optimization, but I think it's also true for anything else in business. So for example, think of all those business books, right? That just gives, examples from the big brands like Google, Facebook, Apple did this, right? Well, what they did, right? Like those are billion-dollar companies. If I'm trying, to solve one specific situation and problem in my business, are those examples truly relevant, right? Maybe some, the concepts are relevant, but is it truly relevant to my business today? Probably not. And a lot of these like button color tests, which is kind of a running gag in the industry, right? Because it's like, oh, change your button color to blue and it will increase your conversions by 100%, right? It's never going to do that. And second, most brands would run that test and it would come up as inconclusive because the change is too small to detect a behavioral change. And you would need ridiculous amount of data to see a change if there would be any. And this example often comes as well from like this random Google or Amazon case study or test that was run like 10, 12 years ago and somebody wrote about it, right? But again, like Amazon is the most or one of the most trafficked website on the planet. This is,
they can get some statistically significant data in 5 minutes probably with the
exactly.
The
and so like situations are different. Like don't look at don't copy Amazon's test on your site.
I want to talk about it. I'm going to just pull up your website for a second here. Last time, we talked a lot about swipe files. So
yeah,
I just encourage everyone, check out, if you go to Inspired Insider and in the search bar, you put SplitBase or Raphael Paulin-Daigle. We went through actually a bunch of, they have swipe files. So if you do want to check them out, you can go to splitbase.com/swipe. I mean, they have a swipe files in the navigation. You can actually take a look of them breaking down a lot of these things that they actually did. And there's a lot of context there, like Raphael said. So there's a lot here that you can actually check out, which I
actually want to add as well. And this should probably be a disclaimer on our side as well, right? Like swipe files, I love them. We built this because I had all of those in a doc. Just in a file. And then we said, well, let's just put it on the website. Right. But to us, the way I use swipe files, it's not like, let's look at how one brand does it and let's copy them, because there's actually some swipes that we've included in there that are things that we don't like. And we put them in swipe files because what it does is, let's say you found a problem through your data, your analytics, maybe through customer surveys, and you're trying to solve that problem, right? Maybe it's that, customers don't know, can't find X pieces of information about your product, right? Well, then you still need to come up with solutions. You've identified the problem. There's probably multiple solutions. That is when it's great, when swipe files can be great, because you still need inspiration somewhere, right? And that's why, I like
where
this
should we
quickly,
look?
Yeah, like exactly. So quickly I can say, okay, well, let's look at product pages across 100 brands quickly. And I can say, how do they display these pieces of information? And knowing the problem I'm trying to solve.
Categories here. You can
exactly
search product pages, collection pages, cart, navigation, landing pages, and then whatever you need.
So knowing what I'm trying to solve, I can go and I can get pieces of information of, okay, well, I like how this brand does it. I don't like how this brand does it. Let's look at how this brand does it, and so on, right? And then we can shape our own strategy using best practices or swap files as starting points, right? They're not solutions. They're not what we're going to be copying, but let's look at what's being done out there. And let's not forget, we don't know how these brands are doing, right? Like it could be working for them. It could not be working as well. So I think it's always good to approach best practices and swap files as inspiration, as a grain of salt, but not as something to copy necessarily.
Love it. Yeah. So you could check that out. And we actually went through a bunch of swipe files last time. So check that episode out. But I want to talk about, and you could check out, they have a case studies page where they break down some of the things they do. So just to give people a sense of that, talk about Dr. Squatch for a second. And we're seeing here, Dr. Squatch adds 800,000 plus a month.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
And that number is probably bigger today, because when we posted that case study, I think it was probably a year or two ago. And, now we've been working with Dr. Squatch for about 4.5 to, if not 5 years. Right. So Dr. Squatch is a brand. When they came to us, they were a pretty small brand. They were not advertising in the Super Bowl yet. They were not a, multiple $100 million business yet. They were about 10 million. And, their marketing team was pretty small, and we were working directly with the founder and CEO. And ultimately, when they approached us, they said, well, hey, we're growing, but we're not testing, we don't know how to make the website better. So can you help us? And that's what we did, right? So we really applied the testing trifecta methodology before just running any test. We tried to understand, okay, well, this is a pretty self-explanatory product, but what are some of the challenges that the brand has, and what are some challenges that maybe customers have? So we did the deep dive into their analytics. We tried to understand how people were navigating from different paid channels, what people were buying together. And then we also, went into the surveys and tried to understand, who are these customers? Are they just like lumberjack style men that, that felt like the persona that we're targeting? Turns out, by the way, we also discovered a lot of women were buying products for their sons and husbands and boyfriends
you
and whatever.
Smell. We need to get you some of this stuff.
Exactly. And,
they're probably the first to buy it.
Yeah. Exactly. And that was really interesting, because we said, wow, well, there's probably room for, campaigns that are targeted towards, these women. And that's exactly what they did. And they're still running those type of campaigns. So ultimately, yeah.
This
Dr.
was a
Squatch,
Super Bowl ad, I think, right here, right?
I think that was Super Bowl from last year, 2 years ago. Yeah, correct. 2021. Wow, time flies. I thought it was last year. But that's the thing, right? We identified the weaknesses. We identified what the brand had to do in order to really move the needle. We actually found out that we had to push the brand towards more bundles, because margins on one $7 bar of soap, well, it's not fantastic if that's the only thing that one person buys. So, we really aim to how do we push more people into bundles, into subscriptions? And over the past couple of years, I mean, we've ran probably hundreds of tests now, and built some landing pages, and really tried to understand, how can we make the website better? And ultimately, well, it paid off, right? And it's still paying off. At the time of this case study, it was about $800,000 a month in additional revenue generated from optimization. There's obviously things that it's hard to quantify, like the fact we discovered there was a woman audience, and then they went and created campaigns. We're not in charge of creating those campaigns, but we did find the insight. How much money does that mean to the brand? I don't know. It's not included in this calculation. We're only looking at the increase from the A/B test. But regardless, it's been a great journey to work with them.
Talk about stages of growth. You see it as a partner to some of these companies, stages of growth in some of the things you see these D2C brands go through.
Yeah. I think the first stage, right, up to about 10 million, and people might have different philosophies on the stages, but at least from what I'm seeing, generally from 0 to 10 million, a lot is about figuring out the best angle, right? It's about figuring out who's the best customer segment and how to best talk to them. I don't think that ever stops, by the way, because obviously as you grow, you're going to have to expand to bigger audiences and to different audiences if you want to keep that pool of potential customer big enough for you to grow as much as you want to grow. But in the beginning, I do think, like in the early stages, I do, under $1 million, for example, we don't really work with these brands, but what I always tell them when they come to us is, I say, well, you really need, don't even think about conversion optimization right now. Focus on messaging, focus on understanding. By the way, to me, it is kind of conversion optimization, figuring out the best message so people resonate. That's what it is for me. My definition of it is pretty large. But yeah, my recommendation is figure out the best messaging, figure out your best ads, figure out the best angles, because as soon as you want to start spending a lot of money on ads and, you want to make sure that you're relevant and you're talking to the right customers. So really that product market fit is super, super important. After that, obviously, when a brand is around 8 to 10 million, if they're not doing CRO, that's where they're losing a lot of money. They're going to be leaving money on the table. They're going to be spending way too much on, not that they're going to be spending too much on ads, but they're not going to be able to get the returns they should be able to get if they were optimizing their websites. Because, you know, that's the thing. People spend so much time focusing on the ads, optimizing the ads, finding the best message, but then the purchase actually happens on your website, right? People get the information, like all the next steps happens on your website. So you need to treat those as one and not as two separate things. And obviously anything beyond 10 million to 100 million, where conversion optimization doesn't have a destination. The key thing though is whatever the test results you get, you need to be able to learn from them if you want to be able to grow from them. And that's something Dr. Squatch has been doing and has done more successfully than a lot of other brands, no matter the test results, right? So let's say we're running 1, 2, or 3 tests in a row that turns out didn't produce any revenue lift, which happens. The actual industry statistics, Jeremy, are that I think about 1 out of 7 tests will win. So that means that 6 out of 7 tests won't produce results that generates you more money. Okay. At SplitBase, our ratio is better than that. That's just generally like across people running A/B tests. But that means that, hey, if you're about to run 6 tests that doesn't produce any lift, well, you better be able to find value out of that somehow, right? Otherwise, you just, you know, it's a long road to getting those lift. And that's what we focused on. So for example, with Dr. Squatch, there's things that we found out their audience didn't care about. Well, great. We learned that through some test, and we were able to, you know, simplify some pieces of the website. And ultimately, you know, that's the thing. As you grow, you really need to be able to use the learnings from an optimization program, what worked and what didn't work, and apply it across your marketing.
Yeah, it allows people to focus on different things, because if, you know, you have a hypothesis, right? And obviously there was a page put up for some reason, and you realize no one's going to that page, and there's maybe multitude of reasons, but it's just as much as maybe cutting stuff out than is adding stuff in, which could be make things clearer, simpler, and easier, I think, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There are so many things that brands assume, you know, all those vendors and apps and Shopify apps, you know, everybody sells their product as install this app, use this, you will increase conversions. It's like kind of the hot UVP for almost everything today. But the truth is, like, there are so many times where, like, virtual try-ons, for example, or you know, like so many things that brands paid a bunch of money to develop or to install. Well, turns out we've tested them, and sometimes they actually lowered conversion rate. So yeah, don't assume that because it's fancy or big or shiny that it's necessarily going to do good for your business. Don't assume anything is kind of how I think of things. Yeah. So
do you have any favorite apps that you
do
like?
I have any favorite apps? I would say, yeah. I do like Replo a lot for landing pages. You know, not every e-commerce brand, even though they're 100% on Shopify and, you know, technical, well, not every brand has a developer in-house or technical skills to maintain and code and make changes to the site all the time. But landing pages obviously are a great way to get more money out of your marketing spend on ads, and they're focused funnels, right? But yeah, and we build those for brands. The thing though is Replo makes building those landing pages so much faster. You don't need a developer. It's really easy to use. It's not too complex, but you can still do pretty much everything you ever dreamed of doing with a landing page. So yeah, Replo is a great tool.
From a growth aspect for these companies, you know, I know part of the ecosystem is venture capital, like as they make more, we mentioned the front. What role have you seen with some of the brands and raising money, and are venture capital is usually involved?
Yeah. Well, I've seen some interesting things which around venture capital and e-commerce, and it's mostly that in the past year or two, that capital kind of dried up for a lot of e-commerce brands. When we look back at like the COVID years, like I don't remember even what year. Was that 2020, 2019? I don't know. But around that time, right, there was like a big surge in e-commerce brands. Like we've seen so many e-commerce brands grow incredibly fast. We saw record amounts of money getting invested into e-commerce brands as well, right? At crazy high valuations. There was really like a peak of D2C investments there. What we started seeing, towards tail end of the pandemic as well, is, well, a lot of these brands were likely only very successful bootstrapped or, with VC investments. It doesn't really matter. We've seen a lot of these brands, though, start declining. A lot of them went away. Like we had a lot of clients over the past years that we lost, not because of us, but just because their business, like they couldn't acquire customers profitably anymore. Like it was just like the business model didn't make any sense. So we kind of saw a cleanup after that big rise. We saw like a cleanup in the space where a lot of brands just disappeared, got acquired. And VC money also starting getting dried up because they saw less promise in this space. I think we're starting to see it come back now, but it's been a very long and slow decline. And it didn't help as well that, the iOS changes made, acquiring customers more difficult. Like there's been a lot of things thrown at brands that made things a bit difficult. Some of them still managed to thrive during all that time. But then we've also seen some big brands like, I think it was like Casper, where like there were some press articles where, like they're not profitable and they were overvalued. It might be the wrong brand I'm thinking of, but there's been a couple of these as well where, big e-commerce brands once valued at massive valuations are, now on shaky grounds. So it's an interesting space.
Who are some of are there any venture capital or companies that stick out to you? When we're thinking of like, people are out there in the D2C space and like, the well-known companies were looking to raise money. I'll just share, there's one guy I had on here. He was an interesting background. I had Zach here of, Newground Ventures. And we talked a little bit about, and his companies, and like some of them were interesting, like Spindrift, which I actually drink, and Zevia, which I actually drink. So we had some interesting conversations. Or any that you've seen, just that are well known in the space?
Yeah, I'm not super up to date, I'm gonna say, on the like VC space. A lot of brands just, they have VC money, but they come to us directly. What I have seen though is, maybe this may not answer your question, but I have seen a lot of, and I'm not going to name them, but I've seen a lot of VC firms that don't know a lot about marketing try to do marketing on behalf of the companies they're invested into. And we're talking about big brands making a lot of money. And that's it's interesting to see, right? Because you see that not the right marketing decisions are always being made. And then I think there's also a focus on the wrong metrics. And anyways, that's a whole other thing. But that I've seen a couple, right? I think it's something that brands should be careful of. But I've also seen some really great ones. Like there's one we work with, Digital Fuel Capital, who really knows their stuff when it comes to digital marketing, right? And they really support their brands in the best ways possible. They know they just know the space really well, and they've worked on, and they've invested in big brands, right? So there's definitely that. I would just say it's something that people should be aware of. There's really, I don't think all the venture capital money is the same, and I know that the agreements with those really vary from brand to brand. Like I said, for some VC firms almost are in charge of all of their brand's marketing, or you really have to use their partners, versus some others, it's really you're on your own and they just invest. I think brands need to really consider that though. And like, what's the level of marketing expertise that you can find in those VC firms?
I want to talk about your podcast and some of the learnings you've had from the podcast. You could see splitbase.com. You can go to the podcast page, Minds of Ecommerce Podcast. Maybe talk about a few interesting episodes people should check out from you?
Lots of great conversations. So nearly everyone that I interview on the podcast are founders of e-commerce brands, with the majority of those brands doing 8 to 9 figures. All obviously are $1 million brands. That last podcast, episode number 33, with the founder of LoomCube, which sells ring lights, which I'm using one right now. So this was very interesting because, I talked earlier in this, episode here that there's a lot of misconceptions and best practices that are being used the wrong ways. And one of those is that a lot of brands, they hear, landing pages are great to increase conversion, so we're just going to build landing pages and we're going to test them. But what happens is a lot of brands don't set the right budget aside in order to test them. They'll build those pages and then they're going to release them. They're going to put $25-$50 a day because, they're like, this page is not proven. We have to test it out. The truth is, now I can tell you this, but you can hear it from Riley directly, the CEO and co-founder of LoomCube. And what he says is he tries to spend between $5,000 and $10,000 minimum on any type of landing pages that he tests. He's trying to get hundreds of transactions per test and he runs those tests for 2 or 3 weeks. And that's the right proper methodology. If you want to test something, you need to have data in order for that data to be reliable. So that episode was really interesting on that end. Another one that I thought was really interesting, if you scroll down a little bit, they're actually all very interesting. But Eat Sleep, it was actually very interesting. Alexander's approach to building partnerships. They've built partnerships with F1, Barry's Fitness, and then I keep seeing, other partnerships that they've done. And their approach to partnerships isn't just to slap your brand name next to another big logo. It's really about, understanding your values and how both audiences can benefit from each other. And I thought that was a pretty fresh take on building and sponsoring brand opportunities.
So people can check out the podcast. You go to splitbase.com and go to the podcast page. It's Minds of Ecommerce Podcast on any of the channels. Raphael, one last question before we end. I want to just encourage people to check out splitbase.com. Last question is just any of your favorite resources. It could be software, tech, it could be a book. What are some resources that have been valuable to you?
Yeah, a couple. I would say on the tech side of things for my day-to-day work, like I said, Replo for building the landing pages and having them live on a site without much coding. That's a great tool. For A/B testing, convert.com, fantastic tool. I actually have this thing behind me here. Convert, we're a certified partner at the highest level with them and have been for 6 years now. I actually don't get a commission from anything we do with them, but they have a great team and it shows when there's, we need customer support. They're a great tool. So convert.com is great for that. I would say in terms of books, there's so many. I'm looking behind me. There's so many that I can think of that are great. I think Profit First is a classic. I know a lot of people are familiar with it. It really changed the way I think about kind of organizing money in the business. So that was really interesting.
Love it. Raphael, yeah, actually, people can check out. I did an episode with Mike Michalowicz, who has several great books. One of them being Profit First. So we talked about, I forgot which book it was on that one, but probably several of them. But check out splitbase.com, more episodes of the podcast. I want to be the first one to, Raphael, thanks for coming on again, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thank you, Jeremy.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like $100 grand.